to the Jew first, part 2. Today I want to look at Acts chapter 6 through 8. Today I want to venture into the next phase of the first century Messianic community's development. Last Shabbat we saw how through the healing of the crippled man, Kepha and Yochanan caused a rapid increase in the number of people who became believers in Yeshua. That was a direct result of what they had witnessed and the personal touch on their own lives of the Ruach HaKodesh. The people were constantly being added to the Messianic community. Kepha addressed the crowd, including many who were Kohanim or Torah teachers, who also frequented the temple courts. He said to them, "Men of Israel, why are you amazed at this? The God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant, Yeshua." But Kepha also rebuked them by saying, "You killed the author of life, but God has raised him from the dead. For this we are witnesses." He then concludes by saying, "You are the sons of the prophets, and you are included in the covenant which God made with our fathers when he said to Abraham, 'By your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed.' So it is that you are the first to whom God has sent his servant, whom he has raised up, that he might bless you by turning each of you from your evil ways." The words that Kepha spoke deeply annoyed many of the Sadducees, or Sadducees, who could not avoid hearing his words while they were present there in the temple courts. The problem was that Kepha's words were directed in direct conflict with their foundational teachings that there is no resurrection. Their core belief was being totally undermined, and Kepha constantly annoyed them by drawing attention to the resurrection of Yeshua as proof that what he was saying was true. After being arrested and reprimanded by the temple authorities and the Sanhedrin, all the emissaries continued teaching and healing both in the temple courts and in the surrounding villages. Each day they'd visit the temple courts and continue regularly meeting together as a body and sharing meals together, continuing that way for an unspecified period. However, as we see in Acts chapter 6, these things were not in total harmony among the people of the community. Many from among the Greek-speaking Jews who had come from various parts of the diaspora began complaining that they, and particularly their widows, were being unfairly disadvantaged by the Hebrew-speaking Jews, most of whom, of course, were local residents in Jerusalem. That is not surprising, because those who came from the diaspora would normally only be in Jerusalem during Pesach and Shavuot, for that period, and then they would depart back to their home country. But having accepted the call of the Ruach HaKodesh, they were now becoming semi-permanent residents among the Hebrew-speaking locals. The increasing unrest was cut short by the 11 emissaries calling a meeting of all the talmidim. Their aim was to select 7 men from the community who had become fully immersed in the Messianic life, who were able to express the attributes and the wisdom of ones who had truly understood the call of the Ruach HaKodesh. In chapter 6, verse 5, Luke lists out the 7 men who were called and set apart to attend to the needs of the community members and to officiate at meal gatherings. By establishing that new rule, the emissaries freed themselves to continue the role of teaching and healing, which the Ruach had placed upon them. The new roles were endorsed by the whole community, and when the emissaries prayed over them and laid their hands upon them, they passed on the mantle of responsibility. It was a wise decision on the part of the emissaries and helped to defuse the divide that was developing between the Hebrew and the Greek-speaking factions within the community. It even paved the way for an ever-increasing number of Kohanim who also became obedient to Yeshua. Because most of the Kohanim were part of the Zedekim sect, which was a quantum leap for those individuals to make, because they had to accept the belief that there is a promise of life after death. That was something that was totally alien, of course, to the members of the Zedekim. What about life? Yerushalayim Messianic community. It appears to have become relatively stable for an unstated period. That is, until Stephen, the leader of the 7 appointed servants, encountered opposition from members of the community called the Synagogue of the Freed Slaves. There is no indication in the Brit Hadashah nor in historical works as to why it was given that title. But it is qualified by a bracketed comment as it was called. So it appears if it may have been a local jibe by the Hebrew-speaking Jews against the Greek community. However, when we look at the names of the places where the members of that synagogue came from, it suggests that it was probably a safe haven for them, the ones who'd come from the diaspora, when they made Aliyah to Yerushalayim for both the Moedim and the agricultural festivals. The regions where the synagogue members originated from were Cyrenia, Alexandria, Cilicia, and the provinces of Asia, coupled with the fact that Stephen was one of the 7 selected to attend to the daily needs of the Greek-speaking Jews. It suggests that he was from one of those regions of the diaspora and part of the Greek-speaking Jews himself. Whatever the reason, as verses 8 and 9 suggest, Stephen, full of grace and power, performed great miracles and signs among the people. But opposition arose amongst the members of the freed slave synagogue. So it may well be that he had been a member of that same synagogue before having become a believer in Yeshua. Most of the synagogue argued that with Stephen, and through the help of the Ruach HaKodesh, by speaking wisdom, he managed to refute the objections that these teachers were putting forward about Yeshua. Not making any headway with their arguments against Stephen, the synagogue leaders had him arrested and brought before the Torah teachers and the Sanhedrin. Stephen was accused of teaching that Yeshua was planning to destroy the temple and that he had spoken against the Torah of Moshe. They became even more incensed by his words of defense when during his testimony his face shone like that of an angel. Looking at chapter 7, it gives a full account of Stephen's testimony, which he delivered before the Sanhedrin as his own defense. He recounted in brief detail the history of Israel, all the way from Abraham right through to the building of the first temple and beyond. He showed the members of the Sanhedrin that at every stage of Israel's journey, they had been stiff-necked and stubborn. And he said to them, you continually opposed the Ruach HaKodesh, and now you are doing the same as your fathers did throughout history. Stephen asked them, which of the prophets did you not persecute? They killed those who told in advance about the coming of the Zadok, that is, the righteous one, namely Yeshua. And now you have become his betrayers and murderers, you who received the Torah as if it was delivered by angels, but you did not keep it. The narrative continues, saying, on hearing these things, they were cut to their hearts and ground their teeth at him. The truth of their reality caused a great deal of adversity. The whole Sanhedrin realized what Stephen was saying was entirely true. At that time, the Sanhedrin was meeting in a shop in the marketplace, because their hall of hewn stone, which had been part of the northern wall of the temple court, had been completely destroyed by the earthquake that occurred at the moment Yeshua died. Therefore, they knew in the moment when Yeshua died that their long-awaited Mashiach. But they still kept on rejecting him. As Stephen stood before them, they were aware that they had not only lost their place of meeting, but they'd also lost their ability to pass a death sentence. They were totally a spent force in Israel. And Stephen wisely said that they were stiff-necked and uncircumcised in both heart and mind. By contrast, Stephen, who was filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, looked up to heaven and saw the Shekinah, or the glory of God. Then he exclaimed to them, "I see in heaven opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." In response, Luke says, they began yelling at the top of their voices so that they wouldn't hear what he was saying. And with one accord they rushed at him, took him outside the city, and began stoning him. As they were stoning him, Stephen called out to God, "Lord Yeshua, receive my spirit." Then he kneeled down and shouted out, "Lord, don't hold this sin against them." And with that he died. The death of Stephen had become the murder of Stephen. Rather than being a death sentence passed down through the authority of the Sanhedrin, because they had lost their authority, it meant that they had jointly partaken in the stoning of Stephen and committing murder. However, there is no mention anywhere of any Sanhedrin members or anybody being personally responsible for the death of Stephen. So it must be assumed that the Roman governor, who of course at that stage was still Pontius Pilate, decided to turn a blind eye to the event, having he himself been the one who had ordered the death of Yeshua. Now that brings us to chapter 8, which at first reading appears to be a rather nonchalant experience in Shomron, or which is now known as Samaria, or as the world calls it, the West Bank. But there's a great deal of depth in this chapter, which begins with the death of Stephen, which immediately engendered a fear among all the members of the Messianic community. Starting in that day, there arose intense persecution against the Messianic community in Jerusalem. Yeshua set out to destroy the Messianic community. Entering house after house, he dragged off both men and women, handed them over to be put in prison. However, those who were scattered announced the good news of the word wherever they went. The timing of that departure from Jerusalem is not stated, but it was the first breakup of the Jerusalem community. As the narrative states, all the talmidim scattered, leaving just the 11 emissaries behind in the city. Then in verse 5, the narrative launches into a discussion about the movements of Philip, who it says went down to the unnamed city of Shomron, where he began to proclaim the message about Yeshua. So who was Philip? The narrative doesn't say. But when we look again at verse 1, it says that all the emissaries remained in Jerusalem. So clearly it could not have been Philip who was one of the 11. So Philip, who went down to Shomron with the other talmidim, must have been one of the 7 servants who had earlier been selected to care for the daily needs of the Greek-speaking Jews in the community. Philip is the second one named after Stephen in the selection of the 7. So it appears that that is the Philip who is being considered. After all, the 11 emissaries remained in Jerusalem because they heeded the words of Yeshua when he had warned not to go near Shomron, when he sent the 12 off on healing missions during his earthly ministry. He said, "You must not go to Shomron, but only to Y'hudah and to the Jews." In Shomron, Philip encountered a man named Shimon, who was practicing magic in the midst of the people of Shomron. Many claimed that he had great healing powers, similar to those of the emissaries of Yeshua. By contrast, when the people heard the good news about the kingdom of God from the mouth of Philip, they realized that there was a profound difference, and many of the men and women, were immersed by Philip. Shimon realized that he was losing ground against the work of Philip. He finally allowed himself to be immersed in the name of Yeshua and became a follower, observing and trying to mimic all the actions of Philip. In time, as verse 14 and 15 suggest, the emissaries in Jerusalem heard that Shomron had received the word of God. So they went down, Kepha and Yochanan went down and prayed for them, that they might receive the Ruach HaKodesh. That they felt the need to go down and help Philip suggests that he may well have been getting out of his depth. And he had been going ahead of the work of the emissaries by setting himself up as an emissary in Shomron. It must be remembered that a large percentage of those people in Shomron were descended from foreigners who had been placed there by Sargon II of Assyria, when he'd taken the 10 tribes of Israel away into exile. And they are yet to return. Hence, there were only a very small number of Jews actually living in Shomron during that first century. That is why Yeshua had earlier forbidden the chosen 12 to speak to people in Shomron. Even Yeshua only ventured into Shomron once during his ministry, on his return journey from Jerusalem back to Nazareth. That was the time when he spoke to the woman at the well. Now Philip appears to have reached out without authority. Hence the situation needed Kepha and Yochanan to go to Shomron in support of Philip. When they arrived, they realized Philip had been immersing people in the name of Yeshua, but he had not placed his hands upon them because he had not been given the authority. Hence the people did not receive the promised Ruach HaKodesh. When Shimon the magician saw how Kepha and Yochanan placed their hands on people, he offered them money to buy the ability to bring down the Ruach HaKodesh upon whomever he laid his hands. However, Kepha berated him severely for trying to monetize the gift the emissaries had received, which had been given exclusively to them by Yeshua himself. Having quietened things down, Kepha and Yochanan gave a thorough witness about Yeshua in the surrounding towns, which appears to have been directly and solely towards the Jews who were living among the people of Shomron. It was clearly not the right time for the good news to be shared widely among foreigners. The whole episode appears to have been a major mistake on the part of Philip, just because he had jumped ahead of the emissaries. After things settled down, Kepha and Yochanan returned to Jerusalem in verse 26, and the angel of Yahweh said to Philip, "Get up, go southward on the road that goes from Jerusalem to Azar in the desert." At this stage, we would do well to reflect back to the gathering that took place on the Mount of Olives, when Yeshua departed into heaven for the last time. Looking at Acts chapter 1 verse 8, he said to the 11, "You will receive power from the Ruach HaKodesh when it comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Y'hudah and Shomron, and indeed to the ends of the earth." But we see this was not yet the time. So coming back to chapter 8 verse 26 and onward, clearly Philip was being quietly removed from the scene before any further problems could arise. There is a good lesson to be learned from this whole incident. Many people feel strong urges to leap up and evangelize the whole world. Well-meaning Christian missionaries have gone out to many diverse parts of the world with the desire to spread what they believe is the good news. But what we are seeing here in Acts chapter 8 is a strong warning that it's very easy to go ahead of God. Yeshua chose the original emissaries and charged them with the responsibility of taking his message to the ends of the earth. Apart from the replacement of Y'hudah of Kariot, that is Judas, which we will discuss next Shabbat, there is no suggestion that he appointed any additional emissaries at the later stage. So we must be careful, very careful, what we teach and to whom we teach it, because we may well be running ahead of the Ruach HaKodesh. Now returning to Philip, we see from Acts chapter 8 verses 26 to 27, he was told, get up and go southward on the road that goes from Jerusalem to Azar. So he got up and went. On his way, he caught sight of an Ethiopian, a eunuch. He had been up to Jerusalem for worship, probably at Shavuot. Here again, Philip encounters yet another opportunity to assist the Ruach HaKodesh. He had not been told to go and look for this Ethiopian eunuch, but there he was, having assisted the Ethiopian to understand the book of Isaiah and having shared the good news about Yeshua. The Ethiopian wanted to be immersed, and once again Philip immersed him in the name of Yeshua. Then in verse 39, when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw no more of him. Once again, Philip had immersed without laying on hands. That may well be the reason why the Ruach snatched him away before he could undertake that responsibility without authority to do so. Wherever he went, from Ashdod right through to Caesarea, he kept on preaching and teaching. The only other mention of Philip appears in Acts chapter 21, verse 7 to 9, where they went to the home of Philip, the proclaimer of the good news, one of the 7, and stayed with him. That's the only other reference to Philip. So he definitely was one of those 7 who had been selected. So in summary, we have seen how the daily teachings about Yeshua, and particularly his resurrection, annoyed the Zedekim to such an extent that they had the emissaries arrested and charged with incitement simply because the Zedekim did not believe in any future beyond the grave. We also saw how the unjustified murder of Stephen at the hands of the Sanhedrin sent shockwaves right through that fledgling Messianic community and caused the talmidim, all of them, besides the 11 emissaries, to flee from Jerusalem. Then in chapter 8, the repeated actions of Philip, one of the 7, who took it upon himself to fulfill the role of an emissary. By immersing people in Shomron in the name of Yeshua, he ran into strong opposition from the worker of magic who tried to replicate everything Philip was doing. Only by the intervention of Kepha and Yochanan was the situation brought to an end. But to prevent Philip from overstepping his responsibilities, yet again he was snatched away by the Spirit of God. So we begin to see that there are many parts of the message of the Brit Hadashah that have been distorted by enthusiastic, well-meaning teachers who have taken it upon themselves the roles that were never given to them. Often the result is to put forward a distorted message simply because they failed to acknowledge the scriptural message was given first and foremostly to the Jews, only then to the Gentiles who were being grafted into the national life of Israel. That's how Shaul explained it all. Never at any stage through the first century or even right through to the 21st century has it ever been passed on to the Christian world. That is an important point to keep uppermost in our minds. It was always given to the Jew first and to the Gentiles who were actually grafted into the national life of Israel. So until next Shabbat, when we will look more deeply into the introduction of Shaul into the Messianic community, I will say once again, Shabbat Shalom.